After more than 1,000 days of fighting, both Ukraine and Russia are desperate for a way to end the war. Ukraine may already have the upper hand. Their invasion of the Kursk region in August left Russia scrambling to recover, a blow Moscow still hasn't come back from. But Ukraine isn't stopping there. In one of his last big decisions before leaving office, President Joe Biden approved Ukraine's use of US-supplied ATACMS missiles to hit targets deep inside Russia. Ukraine didn't hesitate, launching a strike on a weapons facility in Bryansk. Only one missile caused damage, but the message was loud and clear. Ukraine is ready to strike at the heart of Russia. For Putin, it's a nightmare. Trapped and losing ground, he's turning to his most dangerous play yet, threatening nuclear war. Putin has rewritten Russia's nuclear policies, creating a way to justify using nukes against Ukraine. It's a desperate move, showing just how far he's willing to go to avoid defeat. But would he actually press the button? And what does this say about the state of the war? Let's dive into Putin's nuclear gamble and why his threats are more alarming than ever. The most recent change to Russia's nuclear deterrence and defense policy before the start of the Ukraine war came 4 years ago with the 2020 Basic Principles of State Policy of the Russian Federation on Nuclear Deterrence. Briefly stated, the bulk of the policy underlined how Russia could justify using nuclear weapons to ensure the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The doctrine also outlined 4 possible scenarios under which Russia would use nuclear weaponry. The first was direct evidence of a ballistic missile en route to Russian territory or that of its allies, which would constitute a direct attack on Russia or its allies by a country with its own ballistic missile capabilities. Note that the wording of this scenario specifically doesn't refer to a ballistic missile carrying a nuclear warhead, nor does it specify the type of ballistic missile used for the attack, which means an ordinary ballistic missile would qualify for retaliation. The second condition was the use of nuclear weaponry or other types of weapons of mass destruction against Russia or its allies, ostensibly by another nuclear-capable country. The third is an attack on Russian nuclear weapons and arsenal infrastructure, including storage, command, and communication centers. These two would likely be triggered in the event of a nuclear war, where Russia would be one of the targets of a first strike designed to cripple and disable the country's nuclear weapons and prevent retaliation. Of course, in these cases, there's a possibility that nuclear war was already on the horizon, and the other nuclear-capable countries have similar deterrence policies in place. But it's the fourth condition that brought the most criticism. It cited the possibility of nuclear retaliation for using conventional weapons that threatened the very existence of the country. The wording of this condition was remarkably vague, as there was no set standard on what constituted that level of danger to the country. However, the message was much less ambiguous, suggesting that Russia could, and most likely would, use nuclear weaponry when it felt threatened. And there was yet another aspect of the nuclear doctrine that one could discover if they looked at the specific language of the fourth general provision. This provision states that in the event of a military conflict, Russia's policy allows for the prevention of an escalation of military actions and their termination on conditions that are acceptable for the Russian Federation and/or its allies. This wording, along with discussions in Russian defense circles, suggests that Russia sees its nuclear weapons as a tool not just for survival, but for coercion. Even in a conventional conflict, Russia could use the threat of nuclear escalation to bully its opponent into submission, all the while claiming that the terms of the conflict endangered its existence enough to justify such a move. At the time it was altered, the changes in the nuclear deterrence policy might not have made the rounds across news channels. But that changed with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Between February 2022 and October 2024, the Center for Strategic and International Studies counted over 200 instances of Russia referring to the fourth general provision of its nuclear doctrine. These references suggested that Russia might use nuclear weapons not only for survival, but as a coercive tool to end the war in Ukraine on favorable terms to Moscow and its allies. The strategy of saber-rattling, while generally considered underhanded, did bear some fruit, as significant amounts of NATO military donations to Ukraine were delayed for months once Putin or other prominent Russian politicians or ministers threatened a nuclear response. But eventually, most other nations seemed to agree that Russia's nuclear saber-rattling was only empty threats, at least for the first 2.5 years of the war. This meant that NATO started ignoring Russian military theorists' claims of escalating to de-escalate the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, while countries that have a more positive relationship with Russia, such as China and India, pressured Putin into not making any extremely offensive moves, both with ulterior motives that guided them to present themselves as more or less neutral in the conflict. And then, August 2024 rolled around. In an unprecedented move in the war, Ukraine turned the tide and invaded Russian territory, The 3-week campaign in the Kursk region led to the Ukrainian military managing to occupy more territory in Russia than Russia had done in Donbass over the preceding 7 months. The widespread success of the invasion of Kursk had several consequences, all of which would end up degrading Russia's influence as one of the biggest and most powerful militaries in the world. But there were 2 consequences that were arguably the most important. First, the Ukrainian military managed to put Russia on the defensive for the first time. The success of the Kursk invasion showed that for all its numerical advantages, the Russian military relied on stringent and stiff tactics to make progress. When faced with a sudden change in the tide of the war, as with what happened in Kursk, the Russian command initially stammered and failed to mount a decisive response. This was due to a few factors. The bulk of the soldiers that Russia stationed in the region weren't contract soldiers but conscripts, at least according to the statistics posted by the Ukrainian prisons that were processing the captured Russians. The conscripts didn't have enough training, experience, or detailed orders to provide meaningful resistance to the invading army. This led to waves of surrenders across the region, which was partially why the invasion was considered such a resounding success for Ukraine in the first place. Then, the Kremlin was extremely slow to respond to the invasion, with initial reports in Russia falsely suggesting that the invaders were already being repelled by local forces. When that was found to be entirely wrong, the Russian military resorted to more defensive tactics, creating trenches that proved to be only partially successful in slowing down the Ukrainian advance. Ultimately, Russia would only begin the counteroffensive in Kursk in early September, nearly a full month after the Ukrainian soldiers first set foot in the region. And Russia's progress in the region seems to be agonizingly slow. According to Russian news outlets, the military has managed to regain control of only roughly half of the 500 square miles of territory that Ukraine occupied by mid-October. Meanwhile, Ukrainian sources claimed that the Russian counteroffensive only managed to retake 40% of the initial territory. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. The most recent reports from the BBC on November 20th suggest the same statistics as the first Russian report. Regardless, the conflicting reports indicate that even if Russia managed to retake half of the territory within the first month and a half, it's had increasing difficulties in making the final push. But the second, arguably biggest consequence of the Kursk invasion was that Ukraine has technically managed to cross one of the so-called nuclear red lines. These red lines were frequently mentioned in the Kremlin's rhetoric as potential justifications for Russia deploying its nuclear weapons. As previously mentioned, some of the most common red lines that were drawn by the Russian authorities pertain to the types of weaponry being donated to Ukraine, starting with Soviet-era tanks to more modern armor. All of these red lines ended up being crossed as NATO sent increasingly technologically potent tanks to Ukraine, from T-80s to M1 Abrams, Challenger 2s and Leopard 2s. Other red lines included sending F-16s to Ukraine. Moscow's warnings only briefly delayed NATO in donating these aircraft, and they eventually started flying for the Ukrainian Air Force in August. The red line that related to the Kursk invasion addressed what would happen if Ukraine or another country invaded Russia's territory. Ukraine, however, managed to do so without any involvement from the West. At the time, Putin labeled the invading forces as terrorists. Additionally, he called on the ambiguous defense pact with North Korea to justify having the latter send up to 12,000 soldiers to Kursk, all in the name of defending Russia's territorial integrity against the Ukrainian invasion. The North Korean soldiers presumably still have a few more months of training before they can be fully deployed in Kursk and other neighboring regions. The wording of the defense pact suggests that North Korea will be of limited use to Russia offensively, but it could also allow Putin to redouble his counteroffensive efforts in Kursk. Arguably, Russia could have used the invasion of Kursk as a red line to justify firing nuclear weapons into Ukraine, particularly when the invasion turned out to be more extensive than the Kremlin anticipated. After all, Ukraine occupying a piece of Russian territory gives it significantly more bargaining chips for the eventual peace talks, something that is becoming a far likelier event than Russia winning the war in Ukraine in the next year or two. So when nuclear bombs weren't deployed as a response to the Kursk invasion, the West saw it as an opportunity to become bolder in its military donations. The US approved more rounds of both financial and military aid, including sending more ammo for the Patriot anti-air defense system, alongside a second Patriot launch battery allocated to Ukraine in June 2024. The increasing Western support was exactly what Ukraine needed at the time, as elevated media attention refocused the world's view on the war in Ukraine, allowing them to advocate for more aid efforts. The advancing support seemingly culminated in the US finally agreeing to let Ukraine use some of the long-range missiles they donated to be fired into Russian territory. This was yet another of Russia's red lines crossed, and one that was a more direct retaliation, albeit not at the level of a nuclear response. There were a few different reasons why the US approved the use of ATACMS inside Russia. Let's start with a less obvious but perhaps more logical one. Ukraine already had the means to strike deeper into Russia. In addition to the Kursk invasion, Ukraine started ramping up its ability to strike key military targets in Russia through the use of kamikaze drones, which were either repurposed commercial drones for short-range missions or dedicated military drones for long-range ones. While the former has practically transformed the usual decades-long military tactics on the front lines, the latter was a direct result of years of Ukraine's own domestic weapons advancements. In September, long-range drone missions became more ambitious, culminating in a large-scale drone attack that targeted the Russian capital of Moscow on September 10th. While most of the 140-odd drones were intercepted and destroyed by Russian defenses, several drones still managed to strike close to the capital and resulted in a casualty. The ramifications were sudden and clear. Ukraine could build drones that challenged Russia's defenses and worked over long distances that made previous tactics redundant. With Ukraine's burgeoning drone industry and reliance on drone warfare tactics, ATACMS presents somewhat of a redundancy or a side grade to Ukraine's plans. First, ATACMS missiles aren't that long range to begin with, topping out at roughly 200 miles, which is less than the distance from Ukraine to Moscow. Secondly, they are much more expensive to produce than military drones. A military drone at the level of the ones that were used by Ukraine can cost roughly $100,000 to $200,000, while a single ATACMS missile costs over $1 million. Thirdly, Ukraine doesn't have a way to manufacture ATACMS missiles, and its entire supply is based on donations from NATO. This is a supply that's extremely limited at the moment, with indications that Ukraine received no more than 50 missiles over the course of the entire war and no exact way to determine how many are left. But where ATACMS missiles are superior is their ability to bypass modern defensive systems. With the missile being significantly faster than military drones, the Russian anti-air defenses have their work cut out for them for longer-range strikes. Of course, the most recent result of 5 out of 6 missiles fired being destroyed by Russian anti-missile defenses doesn't give much of a boost of confidence in using ATACMS for offensive purposes, but there's no telling whether that trend will continue. Regardless, Ukraine could theoretically use the missiles to disrupt key supply chain operations around Russia, which would ultimately allow Ukrainian drones to focus on launching other attacks on vital command and military centers. So ATACMS might be arriving a bit too late to make a significant difference considering the current state of the war, but there's another, more vital reason why so many decisions regarding where and how to attack are being made at this time. The Biden administration is on its way out. With former President Donald Trump winning the 2024 presidential election and set to be inaugurated on January 20th, 2025, the current administration has a deadline of less than 2 months left to continue to aid Ukraine. After that, it's Trump's turn to make the decisions, which could overturn many of the Biden policies that were made over the past 1,000 days. And NATO, Ukraine, and Russia all know this, which is precisely why the war has ramped up over the past few weeks. With Russia unable to make significant headway in Kursk, North Korean soldiers still in the final stages of training, and no real justification to use nuclear weapons over an invasion that happened months ago, Putin has turned his sights to the active front line in Donbass. There, the Russian military has started to make slow but steady progress, occupying roughly 1,000 square miles of territory in 2024, which is significantly more progress than in the previous year. Even more importantly for Putin, the offensive might be accelerating as the newly occupied territories represent only 656 square miles acquired by September, with half of that progress made in only 3 months. So why is there suddenly worry about using nuclear weapons? The ATACMS being used to attack Russian territory came before Russia overhauled its nuclear defense policy. Unlike the 2020 doctrine, the new wording of the policy implies that Ukraine using third-party weaponry from a nuclear-capable country, such as the US, is considered the same as that third-party country directly attacking Russia. In short, the new policy is precisely worded to create a new round of saber-rattling that directly counters new developments in NATO policies, permitting what Ukraine can do with its weapons. Secondly, the revised doctrine now more broadly refers to detections of aerospace attacks rather than ballistic missile attacks. The term aerospace in this way can either mean missiles, drones, or aircraft, casting a hilariously wide net to cover pretty much any type of option that Ukraine has for conducting long-range strikes. While the Kremlin has officially stated that the new doctrine was carefully reviewed independently of ongoing developments in the war, the wording and how it matches the war efforts say otherwise. Regardless, it would seem that Russia is not yet done with its attempts to saber-rattle Ukraine and NATO into delaying further military aid or reversing some of these policies. The January 20th deadline might seem to be working in Putin's favor, but the reality is slightly more complex. While Trump was significantly more agreeable to Putin's geopolitical goals during his first presidency, there's no telling how he would act in his second term. For one, NATO has shored up many of its apparent weaknesses. with most countries going above the recommended spending levels of 2% of GDP. Meanwhile, countries such as Germany, Poland, and Finland have made significant headway toward modernizing or bolstering their military technology or numbers. Secondly, Trump's deference to Russia's war efforts likely was based on their projecting power, but with how the war in Ukraine has been going, this might not be the case any longer. Remember, Ukraine started the war by having a fifth of Russia's active manpower and about a tenth of its military equipment, which included equipment that was considered older than Russia's. But despite that, Ukraine has managed to repel Russia for much longer than was considered possible in 2022, to the shock of experts and strategists. With NATO support, there's even a possibility of a full-blown Ukrainian victory. This might mean that Trump may actually force Russia and Ukraine to sit for peace talks shortly after he's inaugurated. In that scenario, Ukraine holding Russian territory distinctly works against Putin, as it presents a meaningful weak point for Russian negotiators. So Putin might be inclined to use the renewed nuclear doctrine as an offensive weapon more than before. While previous mentions of using nuclear weapons were done in the context of Russia defending its territory, there's now a possibility, however slight, that Putin might decide to use them to attack Ukraine. How? Well, consider how nuclear weapons were used for the first time in 1945. Japan was on the brink of defeat in conventional warfare, with its sizable navy suffering extreme losses from the US and its allies, yet Japan refused to surrender to the US. That is, until the bombs were dropped. The deployment of the nuclear bombs had three distinct effects on the then current state of World War II. First, it basically forced Japan to surrender, effectively ending the war globally. Secondly, the bombs precluded a more deadly naval invasion of Japan, significantly speeding up the course of the war and possibly saving several hundred thousands of soldiers. Thirdly, the bombings sent a clear message to the Soviet Union concerning American advances in weapons technology and capability. Russia's use of nuclear weapons on Ukraine could, they would hope, essentially achieve the same effects on Ukraine and NATO. This is perhaps one of the main reasons why the Russian military has only increased its offensive efforts in Donbass. With the bulk of the Russian and Ukrainian forces focused on reinforcing the front, Putin might consider dropping a nuclear bomb on a city farther away from the front and deeper into Ukrainian territory. The effect would be similar to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ukraine would lose a large population center and probably one of their main supply lines to the front. Then, with prospects of further bombing on the table, as Russia currently fields close to 1,700 nuclear warheads in active duty, Ukraine would be forced to surrender. Similarly, NATO could see the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine as the start of a lost cause and cede to whatever terms Russia imposes and try to create a new status quo where NATO and Russia redraw the boundaries in Eastern Europe. Even for Russia, the prospect of nuking a single city might be considered an acceptable cost. After all, recently increased conventional shelling, missile strikes, and drone attacks have practically leveled entire neighborhoods, so a low-yield nuclear bomb would only replicate that devastation. Additionally, Russia and Ukraine have extensive experience cleaning up radioactive contamination following the Chernobyl disaster, so Russia could rebuild the cities and use them for industrial purposes it clearly needs them for. Thus, Russia could end up using the nuclear defense policy to conduct offensive warfare instead. But this scenario rests on Russia continuing to make advances in Ukraine. While the Russian military did double its gains in Donbass for 2024 over only 3 months, Ukrainians using ATACMS to strike at supply lines could counter that. Additionally, Biden's administration could very well be planning more aggressive military donations. Short of NATO deploying its own troops in Ukraine, which is another red line that would likely get an immediate widespread response and possibly escalate the war into World War III, Western European countries could start donating more advanced weaponry and equipment than before. Instead of F-16s, Ukraine might receive F-22s and F-35s. The US might start donating significantly larger numbers of Patriot defense systems and ammunition, alongside more ATACMS for both defensive and offensive missions. In addition, the prototypes that Finland has been sending to Ukraine over the past year could start getting actively deployed in larger numbers. On the other side, China has gained significantly more influence over Russia since the war began, being one of its largest trading and economic partners. While China has proposed multiple peace plans, neither has specifically addressed the status of the territory Russia has occupied, leading to criticism for their ambiguity. Unsurprisingly, these plans have gone unanswered by either side. If Putin announced plans to use nuclear weapons, however, China might become alarmed at the prospect of a more direct and comprehensive response from other nuclear powers, most of which are in NATO. If Russia escalates the conflict by using nuclear weapons, the US might immediately become involved in the conflict, regardless of who sits in the White House at the moment. This could end up dragging China into a war that it might not be able to win, even if the war is conventional rather than nuclear in nature. So China's best course of action might be to pacify Russia into not making any additional rash moves, which were already made when Putin enlisted Kim Jong-un's military to fight his battles. Similarly, NATO's best move might be to reinforce Ukraine to demonstrate that the alliance would fully stand to defend the country in the event of a nuclear attack. So far, Putin's actions have revolved around threats and offenses that he could get away with due to support from China and NATO's internal struggles to maintain the status quo. A nuclear attack ostensibly presents a threat to both of these parties. It might be in NATO's best interest to make Ukraine as unpalatable of a nuclear target as possible. But what do you think? How likely is Putin to actually use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Thank you for watching, and leave your comments below. Now go and check out Russia's top nuke targets, or click this other video instead.